Welcome to the Faith in Question podcast, where we scrutinize the Christian faith alongside the perspective of the non-believer, sometimes interviewing them directly, other times responding to their critiques of Christianity and trying to cover the issues that tend to lead to belief or non-belief. Today we're going to be responding to a very common view in biblical scholarship. Now there's this thing called nuclear deterrence, where just 9 countries have a nuke, and they bury them in mountains and in underground bunkers for the purpose of deterring other people, other countries, from challenging them too seriously. And sometimes biblical scholarship has its sort of underground bunkers as well, where if you dare to question the critical scholarship or the, quote, majority or consensus view on scholarship, particularly they'll, sort of bring out these nukes if they need to. And the idea is that critical scholarship tends to think of its view, obviously, as superior to the traditional views about Jesus, even the historical views that go back to the fathers and so on. Their interpretation of the New Testament, they just assume for reasons, not just assume, they have their reasons, but they assume they're superior, and they have some big guns, as you might say, and the average person just isn't usually aware of these, and when they hear a critical scholar present them, they do sound rather convincing. And certainly the average Christian would struggle with them. So what I'd like to do in this podcast is start a series on one particular view that I think is a kind of nuke in an underground bunker, and I'm going to try and drop what they call the GBU 57 and penetrate these bunkers a little bit and try to appeal to both the believer and the non-believer. I don't want the believers just to sort of take at face value the case I'm going to try and make, and I don't want the non-believer to just dismiss it because I'm a Christian and I have my own bunkers that I'm trying to protect and so on. Everybody has their bunkers, of course. So the first thing we're going to talk about is what's called apocalypticism, the view of Jesus that Albert Schweitzer famously enshrined or made popular in his book, and which has really a quite common view still today in modern critical scholarship, which is that Jesus and his disciples taught and believed that he would return in the time where the disciples were still alive conducting their mission. Now, there's more to apocalypticism than this, of course, but this is one of the cornerstones of the view, and it's one that's very important because it would be clear that it's wrong, right? If Jesus himself predicted this, that he would return in the lifetime of the disciples, and he never came, then clearly he's wrong. He was wrong in his predictions and is kind of DQ'd as a prophet. So 2 just on the surface verses that are commonly used that a critical scholar would feel very confident about. We'll talk about more than these, but these are just 2 that anybody could listen to and just immediately think, yeah, that's what it sounds like it's saying. One is at the end of Matthew 16, where Jesus says that there's some of the people who are standing there in his presence who would not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. It certainly seems on its face like it's predicting that some of the people alive who are listening to him will be alive when he comes in his kingdom. And that doesn't appear to have happened. And then in Matthew 24, Jesus said that this generation will not pass away until all these things are accomplished. And one of the things that he just had mentioned in Matthew 24 was the coming of the Son of Man, was his coming. So there's 2 verses that seem to say quite clearly that there were people living in Jesus' day who would not die, would not taste death, would not pass away until he had returned. All right, so what I want to do is look at 2 passages to begin with. One from what's called the Epistula Apostolorum. It's a pseudepigraphical work. It's not actually an epistle of the apostles, despite its name. It's like a forgery written as if it's from the apostles, and it's dated into the 2nd century, somewhere between 100 and 150 or something, somewhere in the first part of the 2nd century. And scholars widely agree on this, of course. And it has a prediction about Jesus coming, and I want to read the prediction to you. The disciples, this is actually from the text, according to Francis Watson's translation. It says, "We said to him," that is to Jesus, we, the apostles, the disciples, said to Jesus, "Lord, how many years will these things be?" And he said to us, "When the 120th year is completed between Pentecost and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the coming of my Father will take place." And that was originally written in Greek and then translated into Coptic, and we have the Coptic version. So in the 120th year, it says, which presumably is the 120th year from his ministry or his death or from when he says it, so somewhere around 30 AD. So if you do 30 AD plus 120, you get to 150 AD. It's a prediction written before 150 AD, circa 150 AD, claiming that Jesus predicted the exact time, roughly the exact time, of his coming in the 150th year. Actually, he says my Father will come, but he goes on to clarify that it's still his coming. All right, and what I want to point out is there's an actual time frame. It's explicit. It's not. There's no really other way to read it. And I mean, maybe it's a little bit mysterious, the wording, as far as how there are some aspects of it, I suppose you could say, are a little mysterious, but most people would have understood that to be a chronological prediction that he will return before 150 AD. And certainly some of the readers interpreted it that way because some of the other manuscripts in other languages changed the 120 year to 150 years. They actually alter the number because I guess since it was after 150 AD and Jesus hadn't returned, they felt they needed to change the actual manuscript so that he didn't appear to be wrong. All right, so that's one example from from a Christian work that's, after the first century. It's not anywhere near the books of the canon as far as I'm concerned. It's certainly later, and it has very specific, exact prediction about the timing of Jesus' coming, and then the Christian readers altered it because I guess it was an embarrassment. Now let's read from Matthew 24, and we're just going to compare the two passages. In Matthew 24, Jesus sat on the Mount of Olives, and the disciples came to him privately, and they said, "Tell us, when will these things be?" He's just talked about the temple being destroyed and the judgment of God. And they said, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" So they ask him a very specific question about when, not just only what will the signs be of his coming, but when will it happen? And now you get his answer. His answer is toward the end of that sermon as he responds to them, because the whole first part is about signs. He says, "But concerning the day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day when Noah entered the ark, and they were unaware, until the flood came and swept them all away, so will be the coming of the Son of Man." And you can see, again, just on its face, that Jesus does not provide here an exact time frame. They ask him about when these things will happen, and he says that no one knows the day or the hour, not even the angels or the Son himself, the Son of Man. Not even he knows. Only the Father knows the timing, the time frame. Now, some people have said that, well, I think what he must mean here is they don't know the day or the hour, but that does not rule out that they could know the year, the month, the week, and so on, the decade. And though I'll just say that I think this is kind of a silly attempt to try and explain the reading, because just in the ancient languages, the idea of day or hour are used constantly just as an expression for the timing of something. They don't quite have the exact word timing. So they would use the expression day or the hour. Jesus says many times, "My hour is not here," or "My hour has come." He's just talking about the timing, not an hour, not a 60-minute period. So this, I think, is just, first of all, kind of an artificial, silly way to read it. But nonetheless, let's just take it seriously. Let's say he meant that he meant you could You could know the year, you could know the month, you could know the decade, you could know it was at in a specific period of history, but you wouldn't know just the day or hour. So let's try and apply that to his example from Noah, because he uses an analogy from Noah to illustrate what he means by people not knowing the day or the hour. And what does he say about it? He says, well, people got married right up until the day Noah entered the ark. Now, is what Jesus means in that analogy that some of the people knew that that was the week that the flood was going to come, and they just got married anyway? Or does he mean, no, they knew the month, they knew it was that month, but they just didn't know it was that day? Of course not. This is would be a very artificial way to try and understand. Actually, it wouldn't make sense. It'd be an obtuse way to try and understand the analogy from Noah. The whole point of drawing the story and commenting on the details about Noah is that if you get married right up until the day Noah enters the ark, it means you're not aware at all that that was the timing of the flood. You just didn't know at all the timing. So I say that again just to reinforce that our interpretation is basically right. They ask him about when his coming is going to be, when are these things going to happen, and he says that it is unknown to everyone, including himself, except the Father. So we've got a problem. We saw that in some early verses in Matthew, I quoted to you these verses, as well as one in Matthew 24 even, Jesus appears to say that the disciples will be alive when he comes, as if he knows the timing. He knows it'll be within, a few decades. People didn't normally live till they were 90. It's not that they couldn't, but the general age, lifespan of a person was going to be, if you were 30 at the time of Jesus' ministry, you're talking 30 to 40 years, maybe 50 max kind of a thing. So you're talking within the next few decades anyway, that you expect Jesus is going to be returning, if that's what those verses mean. And yet we just read an explicit answer to the question of when his coming would be, and he appears to say very clearly that it is unknown. The timing is unknown. So which is it? Well, what do we do with this? We have some verses that seem to say Jesus does know the timing, that it's in the lifetime of the disciples, and a verse that seems explicitly to say he doesn't know when the timing will be. So what are our options, I guess? One option is that Matthew is just a mishmash of contradictions, that the gospel just doesn't even agree with itself. It gives the complete opposite teaching of Jesus in different places, even something as clear and blatant as just simply the timing of his coming. So that's one possibility. Another possibility is that somewhere we're misreading some verses, that the verses are in fact consistent, they're concordant, but we're misreading something somewhere, and they do form a unity of teaching. Now, I want to say just at the beginning that I would generally give an author a presumption of unity, meaning when I read an ancient author, I'm generally going to assume there is some unity, some basic unity, because they put the book together as one narrative. But especially if I see that there are reasons to think that the author is aiming in the direction of unity and clarity. Matthew, in fact, at a literary level, scholars agree, is because the assumption is that Mark wrote his gospel first and Matthew wrote after Mark. And when you compare Matthew's parallel accounts to Mark, a trait of Matthew is that he's often clarifying and explaining Mark. He's supplementing Mark and giving clarity and making things that might have been a little bit more murky or muddy opaque in Mark get clarified frequently in Matthew. It's a common trait of the author is to bring things into clarity. Also, there are some things where there might have been a potential contradiction in Mark that Matthew seems to drop. So scholars frequently think the reference to Abiathar in Mark 2 may have been understood as a contradiction with the original book of Samuel. You don't need to know any of these details. Just know it's an example of a potential contradiction. And it's not. When you get the parallel passage in Matthew, that seeming contradiction is dropped. So scholars think Matthew is, in that case, correcting or smoothing out and making sure there's not a contradiction. So all this to say, these are just common views out in the scholarly world that Matthew is seeming to aim at clarity and at removing contradiction. So it doesn't seem that he would move in the direction of adding something into Matthew that's not in Mark. Some of these things are not in Mark, that would then, seem to present or amplify a contradiction rather than remove it. But then if you just look at the gospel as a whole, Matthew is one of those gospels, one of the four gospels, where there's widespread agreement that it's very carefully constructed. It's just to any casual reader, you can see that Matthew is divided into 6 major parts, and that each of the major parts begins with a narrative or story sequence of events in Jesus' ministry. And then after 8, 10, 12, 14, whatever events, it'll then present a larger section on teaching, where you get an extended teaching section of Jesus. And then you go to the next part, and you get another set of stories, narrative sequence of stories, and then that's followed by teaching. And not only does Matthew do this in 6 very distinct parts, the teaching sections are not normally in Mark. And so they're teaching sections which are supplemented then by Matthew. And they have a refrain. When you come to the end of the teaching section, it says, "It came to pass when Jesus finished these teachings, these parables, these sayings, these words." It's a refrain indicating that there's a closure of that particular section of the book. And so the book seems to be a unity. It's just, again, just in its arrangement, it seems very carefully arranged, and most scholars think of it or read it as more carefully arranged than Mark. So again, all this is to say nothing more than there's, I think we can give at least a starting point of a presumption of unity that we should. That doesn't mean Matthew doesn't have contradictions. It just means we should look more seriously at the possibility that we're misreading some verses along the way. So that's what I'm going to suggest, that there is actually a misreading. In fact, as much as critical scholars think these verses are very clear that Jesus is predicting that he's going to come in the lifetime of the disciples, I'm going to argue that it's actually really clear that they are not saying that. All right? So let's start with Matthew chapter 10 and verse 23. We're just going to do one verse in this podcast. And this is the verse where Jesus says, "Amen, I say to you," or "Truly I say to you, that you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes." This is a statement that's in the middle of Jesus' instructions to the apostles for their mission around Israel. So in Matthew chapters 8 to 10, you have the second section of Matthew. It begins with a series of events, of narrative sequence where Jesus is teaching the disciples about his authority, the authority of his word in particular, and of their role as disciples to follow his word. And he takes them on a literal journey, and a number of events happen where he saves people and he introduces them to his mission of salvation and how they can trust his word and they can submit to the authority of his word. In other words, the chapters are about what it means to be a disciple, fundamentally what it means to be a disciple. And when you get to chapter 10, the teaching sequence, at the end of this narrative sequence, Jesus looks at all of the cities that he's visited, or the people he's interacted with in Galilee, and he laments that they remind him of lost sheep wandering about without a shepherd. They seem just lost, broken, damaged, and without clarity, without the truth, without life, without comfort, and so on. They're like wandering lost sheep. And so as a bird out of that burden, he decides to choose 12 of his disciples and appoint them as apostles, as under-shepherds. so that he might send them forth into these towns and magnify his work of salvation. They'll go, they're granted the authority to heal, to exorcise demons and so on, and to bring life and salvation and deliverance to various towns in Jesus' name, even if Jesus is not there. And so he gives them a series of instructions, of teachings about their mission. All right? And those instructions are all in chapter 10. And the verse we quoted, the verse that seems to say that he will come in the lifetime of the disciples, is in the middle of these instructions to the apostles. Now, the instructions have three simple parts to them. The first part, in verses 5 to 15, are about the geography, the geographical limits of their mission. They're only to reach Israel and not Samaritans, and not go off to Gentiles and so on. They're just supposed to go to the towns of Jews. And he gives them the method that they're supposed to use as they come into these towns. And I won't go into all these details, just to say you can check them out yourself. It's very simple. Verses 5 to 15, part 1, are the instructions about the geographical limits and the method they're to use as they come into these Jewish towns. And then part 2 is about the opposition that they will face as they go into their mission into these various towns, and the persecution they will face, not only from governors, local authorities, and so on, but also from their own families as they try to bring the message of Jesus, the mission of Jesus, into these various towns. And in part 3, in verses 24 to verse 42, the final part, he talks about loyalty to him, that is personal loyalty and personal fidelity to him. And one of the reasons that we are confident that these instructions fall into three parts is not only because those are the different themes of the three parts that I just mentioned, but also because each of the three parts ends with a refrain, which is a common device Matthew uses, just like he does for the whole of the book. He uses it for this particular set of instructions. There is a refrain. And what is the refrain at the end of each of these three parts of the instructions? It's an "Amen, I say to you" statement. At the end of part 1, he says, "Amen, I say to you, it will be more bearable, more tolerable for Sodom and Gomorrah than for these towns who have rejected you in the day of judgment." Because some of the towns would reject the disciples. At the end of part 2, the refrain is, "Amen, I say to you, you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes." And at the end of, that's in verse 23, and then in verse 42, at the end of part 3 of the instructions, is another "Amen, I say to you" statement about how you will never lose your reward, however meager your efforts to contribute to this mission are. So three parts to the instructions to the apostles about their mission. All right? And what we're going to focus on is the end of the second part of the instructions, because it's the refrain where he says, "Amen, I say to you, you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes," that appears to say on the face that Jesus would return before the disciples finished their mission. But let's start by talking about how we know in these sets of instructions to the apostles that this is, you might say, phase 1 of what is called the Great Commission. He gives them extensive teachings about their mission to go forth in his name and save people, heal people, and preach the message of salvation, and the Messiah has come, and things like this. Then, of course, they're going to carry out that mission, although Matthew does not spend much time at all discussing their actual carrying out of that mission on that occasion of their visiting all these towns. He just gives the instructions at length and then moves on into sort of the results of this mission, you might say, at the beginning of chapter 11. So we don't get a lot of details about their mission. When you get to the end of the Gospel of Matthew, after Jesus' resurrection and his appearance to the disciples, he commissions them to go, not now just to the cities of Israel, but to all the nations, to make disciples of all nations. So they're going to go out into the whole world, and they're going to make proclamation of this gospel of salvation, and the mission will be expanded. So that's, I guess, what you might call phase 2, just my terminology. Phase 1, way back here in chapter 10 of Matthew, where they are sent just to the cities of Israel, and then phase 2 at the very end of the gospel, where they get sent out to the whole world. So clearly the geography, I would say, way back in Matthew 10, is that it's limited to just Israel. It's phase 1, you could say, of that commission, that Great Commission. But here's the key idea. When you get to the second part, and he begins to talk about the opposition that the apostles will face in what he's talking about is phase 1 of their mission when they go out to these various towns in Israel, while Jesus is right there sending them out. He says that they will go before synagogues and local governors, prefects, and kings even, and councils, and they will be whipped in opposition, and some of their family members will turn them over to authorities and betray them and things like this. But anybody who is reading that in Matthew chapter 10 would know that you could read the whole Gospel of Matthew, you could read all of Mark, you could read Luke, you could read John, and you could conclude that this kind of opposition did not greet the apostles during the ministry of Jesus. When they went out and Jesus was in his ministry, and they went out and visited various towns, and he was alive himself in one of those towns, they weren't hauled before synagogues and kings and Roman provincial governors and whipped and so on. That type of persecution and opposition happened after Jesus died and was raised from the dead and appointed them to go out into the world. And if you read in the book of Acts, you read of a lot of these things, this type of opposition and persecution. But again, it's part of phase 2 of this mission that he commissions them to. So even in Matthew 10, when you're getting these instructions, it's clear, at least from our author's perspective, Matthew, who's writing decades later, that a lot of these details are things which actually didn't happen in phase 1 of their mission while Jesus was alive, but didn't happen until later. And if you nudged Matthew and said, these things didn't happen while Jesus was alive, I suppose Matthew would simply say, well, yeah, he warned them about what the effects of their mission were going to be when he gave them their first instructions in phase 1. But then once that expanded out after his death and they went into all the nations, they were faced with this opposition, not only in nations around the empire, but also in Israel itself, where some of the apostles were martyred, were killed, were persecuted, beaten, and so on. So, in other words, it's not meant to be a mystery or a confusion. It's clear to any reader that Jesus is talking to the apostles about their mission, and he's confining them to Israel. But some of the elements that he warns them about and instructs them about relate to things that will be part of phase 2 of that mission, that will extend beyond just phase 1, where they visit only the cities of Israel. It's, I suppose, somewhat like when you're talking to freshmen, university freshmen, and freshman orientation, you begin to talk to them about their life in college, and you give them advice. And some of the advice relates to rules that only apply to freshmen, their freshman year. They have certain restrictions their freshman year, say, that they won't have their sophomore, junior, and senior year. And you'll say things to them that apply only to their freshman year. But since it's their freshman orientation to the whole of their college career, you also give them advice about how to survive college, their entire 4-year sequence. And some of the things you apply that you say to them relate to their majors and classes they'll take later, 2-3 years from then. So there's nothing abnormal about addressing someone at the beginning of, say, their mission, their experience, about things that will apply both in a recent, immediate way and then also in a little bit farther off way. And that appears to be the way Matthew 10 reads. Now, the thing to note about these refrains is that each of the refrains at the end of these 3 parts of the instructions, the Amen, I say to you statements, all apply to the eschaton, to the time when Christ returns and there is the execution of the judgment of God on the world. All three relate to that. One relates to how in the day of judgment it'll be more bearable for Sodom and Gomorrah than for some of these towns that the apostles were going to reach out to. And then Jesus explicitly refers to his coming when he is in the one statement we're looking at in chapter 10, verse 23. And then, of course, in the final one, he talks about your reward at his coming, the reward in the eschaton that you'll get once all the mission is complete and so on, are like eternal rewards. So all that to say that even though he's addressing them about phase one of their mission just to Israel, to towns in Israel, the refrain, the encouragement, the warnings at the end that close out each of the three parts of the instructions, the Amen, I say to you statements, are all referring to what? They're referring to the gravity and the importance of their mission. All three statements are meant to emphasize to the apostles how grave, how important, how valuable their mission is, and that the effects of it will be fully realized on the day of Christ's return and the day of God's judgment, so that as they're working through various cities in Israel during Jesus' ministry, they need to know that the effects of it are eternal and relate to the day of judgment and relate to his coming. And of course, as they go on into phase two of their mission and eventually go out into all the nations of the world, their effects of their work, of their mission, again, will be applied on that day of judgment at the time of his return. So let's now just look very precisely at that one statement that some people have asserted is saying that it must mean that Jesus predicts that he will come in the lifetime of the disciples, because it says, you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. What could be clearer than that? It's referring to the apostles. They won't have reached all the towns of Israel before Jesus comes. All right. Well, first of all, it doesn't seem like this could. Let's just look at the sort of what I'll call the obvious meaning in its context. I mean, what's the point of saying it? Well, he's just talked about the persecution, the opposition, antipathy, hostility, and the suffering that the apostles will face as they go forth in this mission. And again, most of the things he talks about don't actually occur to the apostles until phase two of the mission. But nonetheless, they're going to face immense persecution and immense hostility and opposition. And what is the point of his saying at the end where he says, you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes? I think the obvious point is that they're not supposed to give up. In other words, don't stop pressing forward in your mission until the Son of Man comes. You need to keep going from city to city to city and not give up. Why would you be tempted to give up? Because of the persecution and the opposition. If there was ever a time you thought, enough is enough, I'm just going to hang up the sandals, enough of this mission, it's going to be when there's so much of a price to pay in opposition to that mission. It starts to feel fruitless. It starts to feel in vain. And so in the context, he's urging them not to stop going forward. Keep going until the Son of Man comes. I think that's just the obvious point of the statement in that particular context, as it is with the other two. They're all encouragements about the value of what they're doing. And in this particular one, it's not to give up in the face of opposition. Now, the second thing I'll point out is this expression, will not have gone through all the towns of Israel. Well, I don't mean to get all Greek on you, but that's the only place in the whole of Matthew where that word is translated, will not have gone through. I can't think of any other place where the word ever means anything like this. I don't blame them for translating it that way in the sense that it's somewhat of the idea, but this word is teleo, the verb is telos, the noun telos. It's the same word Jesus says on the cross where he says, it is finished at the end of John. And if you said it is finished, when he says it is finished, you would understand that to mean that his ministry has been brought to its fulfillment, has brought to its completion. That's what you would think of, like it's been accomplished, salvation's been accomplished. Something like that is what he means when he says it is finished. So in the Gospel of Matthew, I mentioned the refrains that divide the whole gospel. It says that at the end of his teaching, he'll always say, it came to pass when, or rather Matthew will say as the narrator, it came to pass when Jesus finished these parables, these teachings, these words. It's the same word when he had finished teaching. Like he gave 7 parables and now he has brought them to a completion. He's finished them. He's brought them to an end. And then he goes on to the next phase of the gospel. So this is the same word. And the NIV actually is the only translation, when I just quick looked at a handful of translations, that translates this more precisely, where it's very, very clear that Jesus says to the disciples, you will not have finished. Well, finished what? Well, it means you will not have brought to an end, or brought to a fulfillment, or brought to a completion. Brought what to a completion? And the answer is their mission. They will have not accomplished fully or fulfilled their mission until the Son of Man comes. And I think that had they just translated it like they do on all the other words that you find in Matthew, the one at the end of chapter 7, beginning of chapter 11, beginning of chapter 19, beginning of chapter 26, if they just translated the word the same way, like the NIV did, it'd be a little bit clearer what he's saying. And that is, he's telling the disciples, you will not bring to an end, you will not fulfill or finish out your mission until the Son of Man comes. And the point of that statement, again, is that they're under persecution, they're under opposition, and there's going to be a temptation to drop off, to give up, to hang your sandals and just say, enough's enough, I've given enough to this mission. And he's urging them to keep pressing forward. Amen, I say to you, you will not have completed this mission until the Son of Man comes. Just keep pressing forward. Now, you might say, well, yeah, but he does specifically say the towns of Israel. Well, that's true because it's phase 1. That's what he's talking about in the immediate context. But let's also think about it from Matthew's perspective. Let's assume for the moment that he really did sit down around 85 AD and wrote the gospel. Would he have looked across the cities of Israel, the towns of Israel in his day, and have thought that the mission of Jesus had been brought to fulfillment, had been brought to an end, to its completion? I mean, the city of Jerusalem was laid waste by the Romans in 70 AD. There were a small proportion of Jews who had converted to becoming followers of Jesus, but the majority of the population didn't, and it was now scattered around the Roman Empire. There were vestiges, of course, the various enclaves of Jews still around Israel and near Jerusalem. But what would Matthew have thought, even as he wrote the gospel, that the mission had been brought to its completion, or was even close to being finished, the word he chose to use in reporting Jesus' instructions to the disciples? No. He clearly would have understood it as that, even as he wrote, that Christians faced still quite a bit of persecution, opposition, and that the mission, not only to the world in general, but also still to the towns of Israel, had not yet been brought to completion. There was still work to be done, and the disciples of his day needed to make sure that they weren't just giving up. They weren't just abandoning the work because of the seeming, of the realistic opposition, antipathy, and hostility toward Jesus in some circles and toward his message. Maybe you disagree with my reading of the passage. I think it's the most natural one. But you can go over to the iPub YouTube channel where we cross-post the podcast, and you can comment and critique my understanding of Matthew 10. And what are your thoughts on the verse and on the passage, in general in Matthew 10? and how it relates to these other issues, I definitely would look forward to any thoughtful replies. In future podcasts, in addition to continuing to interview non-believers, we'll return to some of the other verses that scholars consider the cornerstones of this Jewish apocalyptic view of Jesus, that he taught that he was going to return in the lifetime of in the lifetime of the disciples. Until next time.